Now, Brendan O'Neill, the reason that I love your writing so much for Spiked Online and The Spectator is that it does make me think. And very often you are prepared to go to places where others don't. And I think really go against the mob, which is something that can be particularly difficult in our current media environment. And you did it this week over Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, the former prince, the former Duke of York, who most of us in both the independent media and the mainstream media are hammering for a whole load of reasons. Now, weirdly, your piece, I would usually completely agree with the sentiment of it. And I don't when it comes to Andrew, and I want to explain why. But first, I just want to take people into what you said, because it was beautifully articulated. And as I say, in a lot of ways, I do agree with the philosophy of what you're saying, because I hate these media witch hunts, having been subjected to one myself. And you literally headlined at the hunting of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. And you argued, what do we want from Andrew? When will the mass stalking of him like a wounded deer finally be satiated? When his head is on a spike? When all memory of him is scrubbed from the public record? I get it. Andrew is far from a sympathetic character. He strikes me as a boorish, pompous, and unlikely to take kindly to Republican riffraff like me. But so what? Don't even the disagreeable deserve fair treatment and the presumption of innocence? The hunting of Andrew has gone too far. Admit it, you can feel it. His arrest this week on suspicion of misconduct in public office unleashed yet another round of prideful animus for the former prince. Social media was a riot of malicious glee. Then came that photograph of him in the back of his car following his release from custody. He looked startled, haunted, frightened. The mob lapped it up. They wrung pleasure from his pain. We don't even know if Andrew is guilty. He hasn't even been charged. Will I be denounced as a snivelling apologist for the venal elites if I humbly suggest we let justice take its course? Right now, Andrew is as innocent of the crime of misconduct in public office as you are, dear reader. Praying for the swift ruination of a wealthy former royal is no better than dreaming of the stocks for a poor woman suspected of stealing bread. In both cases, a twisted clamour for vengeance drowns out the enlightened ideals of justice. Republic, the anti-monarchy pressure group, has been giddily whipping up anti-Andrew sentiment. As a lifelong Republican, I find their antics shameful. The case for Republic should be made positively. It should be about appealing to the good moral sense of the everyday Brit. Who must Republicans trust to choose for themselves their head of state? In marshalling mob heresy against a former prince, Republic is betraying Republican principles. They're playing the very games of court gossip and medieval finger-pointing that Republicans once wanted to consign to the history books. Then there is the King's behaviour. His perfunctory remarks on Andrew's arrest feel cold, unbecoming of a brother. There is no expression of fraternal concern, no plea for calm in the digital realm, no defence of Andrew from the truthless accusations that bubble like effluent in the cesspit of social media. I have 5 brothers. If one of them were going through what Andrew is going through, I'd be right in his corner, insisting on fairness and truth. Your Majesty, I know you have your differences with Andrew, but you know what they say, me against my brother, but my brother and I against. Then look, this was so interesting to me on so many levels, and actually, I do agree with you about how this has gone too far in the media. And indeed, this weekend, I do have a special episode coming up with Lady Victoria Harvey, because the reason why Lady Victoria has been pilloried and went on Piers Morgan's Uncensored show and literally had her microphone turned off, in the irony of all ironies, because she was actually censored by Piers, is because she is standing by Andrew, and she is the only one prepared to do so. But here's where I disagree with you, and why I think the Andrew case is very different, and I want to have a discussion with you about it. If it were not for constant media pressure, and yes, you could argue a witch hunt on Andrew since 2011, all of his alleged crimes would have been covered up. There would be no Epstein files. Like, with this case, Brennan, it's so different because all of these allegations were basically made public in 2011, and multiple times the police refused to even open an investigation, right? And we now know there are 10 open. So the standards were different because Andrew was protected in a way that someone like me, going through a witch hunt where the police immediately decided to open a spurious investigation were not. Do you see what I mean? It's like without the witch hunt here, everyone would have got away with everything.
You know, Dan, I can't tell you how much flack I've had for that piece. I mean, it has been relentless. I mean, I'm not on X. I've never been on X. But every time I open my Instagram page, there's someone calling me a pedophile. I mean, it is just insane.
Which is nuts because the piece was incredible.
Yeah, it's nuts, isn't it? Because and that's the thing that worries me. The reason I'm saying that is not to try and get your viewers to sympathize with me or anything like that. It's because it's the culture around this issue that worries me. So I think you're right. There are loads of questions for Andrew to answer. And misconduct in public office is quite serious. It has, as we know, it has a maximum sentence of life imprisonment. So it's a serious thing. And there are questions for him to answer about the foolishness of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, even after Epstein was found guilty of serious offences. Allegedly forwarding documents to him when he was UK trade envoy. That's a very foolish thing to do if he did do that. So there are questions to answer. And you're right. There was a culture of him getting away with it for too long. And I think that's where the media has an important role to put pressure on the establishment to say, listen, just answer these questions. We need to know the truth. So I agree with all of that. And that's sometimes a good role that even the mainstream media can play at times, where they put pressure on the elites to be open about things that are going on. But I don't like the more ruthless, gleeful culture that surrounds it. The thing that's worrying me right now is not only that people are saying we want to know the truth about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, but they're also saying get rid of him. Cast him out into obscurity, destroy his life. He's the worst man who ever lived. I did a discussion about this on Australian TV last night. They've stitched me up a little bit because they presented me as a pro Andrew person, which I don't think I am. I'm pro justice, not pro Andrew. But they said at the start of the show that everyone in the world hates Prince Andrew except this one person, and then they brought me on supposedly to defend him.
But it does sometimes feel that way.
Dan Wootton raises a series of claims that deserve closer examination, not because they are sensational, but because of what they imply. In his discussion with Brendan O'Neill, Dan frames a tension many viewers will recognize: the public appetite for accountability when powerful people are accused of serious misconduct, versus the very real risk that accountability becomes something else entirely: a spectacle, a moral performance, even a kind of entertainment. Dan reads from O'Neill's argument that the hunting of Prince Andrew has taken on the character of a mob ritual, and he largely agrees with the diagnosis of cultural cruelty. But he then draws a sharp distinction. In Andrew's case, he argues, sustained media pressure may have been the only force capable of piercing years of alleged institutional protection. That's the core question here. When does scrutiny protect the public, and when does it become a substitute for justice? First, O'Neill's point about presumption of innocence is not a technicality. It's the foundation of any credible legal system. If someone has been arrested or investigated, that does not automatically mean guilt. The modern information ecosystem blurs those lines deliberately. Headlines and clips travel faster than court processes, and moral certainty becomes a currency. In that environment, it's possible for the public to be encouraged to feel like a verdict has already been reached. And yet, Dan's counterpoint is also hard to dismiss. He argues that without pressure, certain allegations involving elite figures can remain stalled indefinitely. He references a pattern: allegations reported years earlier, authorities declining to investigate, then sudden movement once public attention becomes impossible to ignore. Whether or not a viewer agrees with his specific examples, the broader pattern is worth interrogating. Public institutions do sometimes respond to reputational heat, and that creates a troubling incentive structure. Justice becomes reactive, not principled. So we have two uncomfortable truths coexisting. Truth 1. Mob culture can be vicious, dehumanizing, and reckless. Truth 2. Power can insulate people from scrutiny, and media attention can sometimes break that insulation. The danger is what happens when society tries to solve the second problem with the first method. O'Neill describes the online glee and the hunger for humiliation, the photograph, the commentary, the pleasure taken in fear. Dan acknowledges that atmosphere, and it matters, because it signals a shift. People aren't only demanding answers, They're demanding punishment as performance. That's where the justice principle begins to deform.
There's a problem with, I think, when it becomes this global demonization, when it becomes this global move, not only to say, tell us the truth, but also to say, destroy this man's life. That's what makes me uncomfortable. And the reason it makes me uncomfortable is precisely because of what happened to you, Dan, what's happened to other people in the public eye, people who haven't committed any crimes at all, or who just have the wrong opinion. You know, we know that we live in the era of the cancel culture. We live in an era of the mob, the intolerant, usually faux left mob, which goes after people and demands their scalp and tries to silence them and tries to destroy them, in fact, tries to completely cancel them from public life. So anything that has the whiff of that makes me feel uncomfortable, because I don't want to give any leeway to that culture. And that's really what I'm trying to get at here.
Yeah, and me too. And that's why I wanted to discuss it with you today. And it is also the reason that I wanted to have Lady Victoria on, because I see the way she's been put on the mainstream media as like the woman in the stocks. You know, it's like, oh, LBC will have her on so they can make her look like a stupid fool because she's standing by Andrew. And she did make the point on this Piers Morgan Show episode that actually, well, do you want Andrew to be the next Caroline Flack? And I do think that is a fair question. But I guess where I come from is that it's disgusting that there has been this cover-up for 15 years. And the problem is, Brendan, the police have a lot to answer for in all of this, because so often now the police only move when the media move. And that's so wrong. Like, why do we have police forces completely dictated by by media hysteria, basically? And I use the example of Russell Brand, where like all of a sudden the Metropolitan Police were releasing statements all the time saying, we urge any woman who's ever had anything to do with Russell Brand essentially to come forward. And we saw the same thing happen over the past week with Andrew, right, in regards to the Royal Protection Officers who have been guarding Andrew, you know, for his entire life, and who they had never bothered to interview or look into the details about his visits to Jeffrey Epstein's house in New York in 2011. And all of a sudden they were releasing a statement sort of saying, we're calling on Royal Protection Officers now to come forward. And it is all because the police very often just feel like they have to be doing something because of media hysteria. And I hate that. I think it is so damaging to our society.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, you know, one of the reasons I'm a Republican, I've always been a Republican, and I'm sure many of your viewers aren't Republicans. And
I'm certainly not.
I've had lots of healthy discussions with people over the past a lot of people have responded to my piece by saying, what do you mean you're a Republican? That's the thing they're most shocked about.
Shocks me.
But one of the reasons I am a Republican is because I don't like the institution of royalty. And one of the reasons I don't like it is because it does confer privilege on this family. It does often protect them from what the rest of us have to answer for if we commit a moral error or commit an offense. So it does have that tendency to protect them from, you know, the equality of justice. You know, we're all supposed to be equal before the law. And what that means is, firstly, I think it means that Andrew does deserve the same fair treatment as the rest of us should expect. But it also means that the royal family should be open to interrogation in the way that normal people are as well. So that's one of the, so I agree that there has been too much shielding of Andrew from legitimate questions about his problematic behavior. And that does need to be taken down. But I think the issue I have is just that it has become this very salacious endeavor where you have people around the world, in fact, it has become like a witch hunt. You know, ding dong, the witch is dead. Let's get him. Let's push him over the edge. And I think Victoria is right to be concerned about his mental health. I think she's right. I don't think he's on the internet looking at all this stuff. I certainly hope he isn't, because he completely insane. But I do think he is arguably the most beleaguered man in Britain right now. It must be profoundly unpleasant. And all I'm saying is there must be a way that we can hold him to account for what he may have done wrong, but also not destroy his life. And I just finding that balance, I think, is quite important, not to defend him, but to defend the values of a civilized society.
Totally. And usually, as I say, I would 100% agree. And I do agree with the philosophy, but the problem is I'm also just very conscious that for 15 years, there has been a cover-up in this case, and everything that's been investigated now, or literally all of it, like, it was in the newspapers 15 years ago, and the police did nothing, not a thing.
Well, the police, one problem with the police is that they are very political. That's a real issue we have at the moment. We have a politicized police force that will investigate certain things if it's woke to do so and ignore other things because it doesn't fit into the moral narrative. So ripping away the political bias from the police, including in relation to Andrew, that's a very important thing to do.
Yeah, no, it is. It is incredibly important.
You can believe someone should face questioning, investigation, and due process and still reject the crowd's desire to destroy a person as a symbolic victory. There's also a strategic dimension Dan hints at, even if he doesn't fully unpack it. Institutions can sometimes tolerate or even quietly benefit from a single figure becoming the lightning rod. When attention condenses onto one villain, it can reduce pressure on systems, enablers, and networks. In other words, public fury can be both righteous and exploitable. That's not a defense of anyone, it's an observation about incentives. A scandal framed as one bad actor is often easier to survive than a scandal framed as a culture of protection. This is where Dan's frustration at policing by headline is significant. He appears to argue that authorities move when the media moves, and that this is corrosive. It encourages selective enforcement, fuels conspiracy thinking, and rewards the loudest narrative rather than the strongest evidence. Whether you're a monarchist or a Republican, you should be uneasy about that. A society cannot credibly claim equality before the law if enforcement is shaped by reputational panic. At the same time, O'Neill makes another point that deserves attention. If you care about reform, including Republican reform, it should be built on principles, not on bloodsport. If your argument against monarchy is that privilege distorts justice, then you don't strengthen your case by cheering a digital lynch mob. You strengthen it by demanding transparent standards: who is investigated, on what threshold, with what safeguards, and how long institutions can delay before accountability is triggered. And then there's the human factor, not as a plea for sympathy, but as a warning about what mob logic does to everyone. O'Neill mentions the mental toll of sustained demonization, and Dan references the culture around these stories. This is where we have to be careful. Concern about mob cruelty is not the same as absolution. It's possible to insist on full investigation and still insist that public discourse remains tethered to evidence, not fantasies of ruin. So what should an intelligent audience take from this exchange? 1. Keep the categories separate. Investigation is not conviction. Scrutiny is not sadism. 2. Demand institutional clarity. If allegations are serious, processes should be timely and consistent, not activated only when outrage peaks. 3. Watch the incentive games. Scandals can be used to launder reputations, sacrifice expendable figures, or distract from wider accountability. And 4. Resist moral shortcuts. A civilized society can pursue truth without turning humiliation into a public hobby. Dan Wootton and Brendan O'Neill, in different ways, are circling the same fear, that we are losing the discipline required for justice, the discipline to wait for evidence, to tolerate due process, and to hold systems accountable without becoming what we claim to oppose.